Evening tonight has been organized by Martti Kalliala from Finland. Martti is an architect and he has been supported by the Finnish Möbius Fellowship from the Finnish Cultural Institute and has been working with us over the past months on organizing these events. And yeah, Martti will introduce the rest of the speakers, but I wanted to thank you for doing a nice job. And the team here for always doing a nice job.
Thanks all for coming. And yeah, thanks to Van Alen. Specifically Sarah Farwell, who's been like very, an important contact with Van Alen in terms of putting this thing together. And yeah, I guess also thanks to the Finnish Cultural Institute in New York, who kind of supported this venture. So I mean, just like quickly about tonight's program, I'll do like a quick like introduction to the general theme or the kind of like motivation for like setting up such a program. Then we'll so as many of you saw, like Nick Land, the British philosopher / theorist, is part of the program. I mean, he's not physically present here. He's based in Shanghai, so he produced a video lecture. His first video lecture. So we're going to do that, and after this, we'll move into like a discussion or a group interview with Ed Keller, Andrea Crespo, and Geoff Manaugh. There's also, I mean, surely like many of you noticed, also in the program that there's like this event like included a multimedia piece by me and the artist Daniel Keller, who actually just like saw somewhere in the back. It was actually supposed to be like a panoramic. The thing you saw before this on the projector, that was actually like a kind of like a beta preview of that project. But it was actually like originally something that was developed for this wall here that like eventually will have a 10 projector like media wall installation, which unfortunately isn't ready yet. I mean, this space opened last week, so it didn't get finished on time. So we're showing this preview tonight. And another omission of into the program, also like the CEO and founder of Bitnation, Susanne Tarkowski Tempelhof, was part of the program, who was also supposed to be like telepresent here. She's in. Did I just like lose the mic? Hello? Yeah. Hello? 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 Okay. I hope they're going to work a bit more consistently. She made this interview. We did this interview earlier this week, but she's in Ghana setting up some kind of like cryptocurrency program there, like with spotty internet. Like in the end, like uploading her interview turned out to be impossible. So that will be later available online. Sorry for this unfortunate omission. But anyway, and also just still referring to the piece we developed with Daniel. Also thanks to Marco Copelli and Grete Sosalo who were important, crucial in realizing that piece of work. And by the way, that piece of work will actually be shown in 2015 in its like full panoramic glory. So just to quickly introduce the theme, and my personal motivation, like why to set up such a program. And maybe also, I'm also maybe trying to give it a bit of an architectural footing. So why discussing issues like tech-secessionism is meaningful in a space like this, in an institution that's devoted to issues pertaining to architecture and the built environment. So for a while now, an important focus of my work has been the idea of the island, I mean, like in a kind of in a physical and kind of metaphorical sense, the spaces that are separated, like isolated from the immediate context, that that have a like limit and boundary that are, and at the same time also like constitute like an outside to their to something. I mean, to the context to which they're an island, and of course, this is also like a recurring trope in literature, like culture production at large. I would say like major part of Western cultural production is based on this drive, and of course, for example, sci-fi literature has been anticipating many of these like island-like spaces that we're gonna like discuss or refer to tonight already like decades ago. But yeah, like in terms of architecture, the city, spatial practice, for the lack of better term, the island can mean, it can be interpreted in a variety of forms, like the idea of the zone, like space of legal exemption, states of exception, all these kind of like manipulations of sovereignty that Keller Easterling, the theorist, refers to as extra statecraft, different forms of enclaves. Did I again lose them? No, now it's back. Enclaves and also like architecture structures in the city as these two like seminal projects here. But so like why I think this is important, like why this is like an thing that's interesting for architecture or for kind of like an architectural intelligence is this fact that architecture for in order to exist or as a discipline or and as a kind of as a practice, that it always needs to like somehow like comply or align itself with power, or like different modes of power, because like architecture, like the built realm always represents, but more importantly, it embodies and like reproduces the kind of the kind of kinds of power, like modes of power that produce it in the first place. So, but now like increasingly like space is not being produced, but by these means that are known to architects, so they kind of like what's considered to be like the core practice of architecture. But it happens more and more, and then like now again, like referring a lot to the work of Keller Easterling, it's happening more and more through infrastructure, like infrastructure meaning global standards, kind of like spatial formulas, how to like certain kind of like resorts for I mean like resorts around the world, like like indistinguishable from each other, like being produced like according to these formulas that are actually like not written in the language of architecture, but branding, law, global standards, and so forth. And I said like most like important like language, and that somehow this side of the story is a very like a crucial part of this infrastructure. And of course, Silicon Valley, by Silicon Valley I refer not only to like this Silicon Valley the place, but like the tech sphere at large, is of course one of the most important manufacturers of these stories, of this language that actually also like now produces space, or affects the production of space in a very like fundamental manner. And like what in a sense like makes it even more, or like somehow like looking at what makes looking at Silicon Valley like even more urgent is the fact that of course like commands like immense amounts of like financial and cultural capital. So this event takes its name from this talk that took place at Stanford at the conference event organized by Y Combinator, which is a like a startup incubator. where Balaji Srinivasan, who's a youngish partner of Andreessen Horowitz, which is like one of the more important venture capital companies, gave a talk called Silicon Valley's Ultimate Exit. And basically, the gist of the talk that he gave is as Silicon Valley has more like disrupted like all of the industries, all of the kind of the core industries of other like former U.S. power centers, like governance in Washington, media and finance in New York, the entertainment industry in Hollywood, and education, Harvard, or let's say Cambridge, or like the Ivy League schools. In general, rather than somehow like fight, fight or compete with these kind of like legacy systems, it's time for Silicon Valley to leave behind the so-called paper belt that it was this like blanket term for the rest of the United States, and presumably like the rest of the world, and exit. And I mean, like probably many of you read these articles that it spawned. I mean, it spawned like really like strong media reaction. I mean, there's also like I will also like identify the term tech-secessionism or Silicon Valley secessionism with this media backlash that it ignited. Like this is like early spring 2014, and it also these other like so-called like secessionist tendencies or like ideas of other like tech tycoons such as like Peter Thiel, who's the co-founder and like main founder of the Seasteading Institute, for example, Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, who's been advocating for Google to establish kind of free zone where to test technologies that are currently like regulated, and like Elon Musk. I mean, you could also like look at Elon Musk's Mars plans as a mode of escape or exit. So there was like this like huge media backlash where which can paint the picture of these like tech tycoons as like Bond villains or these like Machiavellian figures. But what was like to me like more like most interesting in this talk is this idea of the exit. So basically, Srinivasan kind of summons up this book. I think it came out in 1970 by Albert Hirschman, who's actually also like from Stanford, an economist, like who published a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And the idea of like the kind of basic premise or idea of this book or treatise was that any human organization, be it like marriage, a business, a state, whatever, like unless it has a feedback mechanism, its service it will like decline. And basically there are like two modes of feedback. The other one is voice, which we broadly understand as politics. Now, like voting or like in terms of business, like leaving a letter of complaint, for example. And the other one is exit, which is somehow the antithesis of politics, which is just switching service providers, immigrating, just leaving your job, starting your own company. And of course, like, this is like opting out, basically, or resigning or abandoning something. And of course, like this is something that fits perfectly the Silicon Valley ethos, or the language itself. Like the whole idea of disruption is like based on this like exit. Like Soylent is an exit from food. Or the start of this like somehow like an exit from like a standardized career. But it also it also has like a lot, this idea of like exit also has like a lot of traction. Is like more like, let's say, like politically conscious like circles of Silicon Valley. So like from like the kind of like more like run-of-the-mill classic like cyber libertarians, and to people with this sort of like neo-reactionary leanings, which you might or might not be familiar with. But well, anyway, I really became interested in how this idea or meme, or this idea of exit, like how it drives the kind of production of space. And actually, well, like after this backlash apology is written, Rosen like made this kind of apologist article that he wrote for The Wired, where he some explained, okay, I wasn't really advocating like secession, but more like the creation of a special economic zone. And anyway, like somehow like space that falls out of the jurisdiction of the federal state. And kind of like echoing the mantra of his employer, Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital company, whose like slogan is "Software is eating the world." He kind of turned it into this like subtle version where software is reorganizing the world. So he presented this chart, like what he actually means by this kind of by this idea of exit. So like he's basically like referring to these communities that are formed online, like communities that come into being through communication technology that like didn't exist like a while ago. So basically, like, well, I mean, as you can see here, as it's like a like more ephemeral or casual, it's like coffee with a LinkedIn contact, and at the other end of the spectrum, you would have communities that that form online, but actually in the end end up occupying physical space, like in the form of cloud towns, cloud cities, cloud districts, or cloud countries. But yeah, so this is something that I found fascinating, or like somehow I feel like this, even if this idea of exit isn't like super widespread, it's not it's not an idea that isn't like that widely used. It's somehow I feel it kind of captures a really like a phenomena or like a disposition, like a cultural or like generational disposition that I at least like myself I feel I can like identify or see around myself. But so at the same time, of course, like as an architect, I get like very interested like what's like the spatial imaginary of exit, like what does exit look like as a space? I mean, of course, it looks like Burning Man, it looks like Elysium, it looks like Charlie cities in the Central American jungle. It looks like see the blue seed, like this incubator space that's essentially like a cruise ship. That's the kind of sails the waters, like I mean, it's just like far enough from San Francisco to evade American labor laws or immigration laws. Which is fascinating. But also, I'm very interested. Like, so what does it mean on like what does exit mean then on a like I mean like if these are kind of collective forms, like the kind of results of collective exits into these kind of imaginary real frontier spaces. Like I mean, if you look at them, like they're either all like in the oceans, in the desert, in space, or jungle. I mean, those are kind of like the kind of frontier conditions that we're able to imagine now. But I'm also like very curious, like so what does this idea of exit then like beyond the tycoons or corporations or these cyber libertarian or near reaction like ideologues, like what does exit mean from an individual perspective? Like what is the psychology of this disposition towards exit, and because like many of these these spaces actually represent things things such as like panic rooms or like walled gardens or safe spaces to many of these inhabitants. And also like another thing that I'm very interested in is why is exit or this idea of exit why does it have so much traction in the tech sphere or like the STEM science, technology, engineering, mathematics, these fields in general. Like is there like a psychological correlate with this desire for escape or for an outside that's somehow imminent to those fields, and also what is in the end what lies beyond this these kind of almost like archaic forms of exit, what is actually like the ultimate exit. So that's basically it. So I don't have a thesis. I don't know. I'm very curious to find out. And that's also why I invited people who I feel like are more equipped to answer many of these questions that I have related to exit, specifically exit as a space. And then maybe just quickly as a kind of as a bridge to Nick Lan's presentation, which we're going to see next. Maybe it's good to somehow clarify the term tech-secessionism, or what do I mean by it? I mean a term that's, I can't remember how many Google hits you will find with tech-secessionism, but it's not a lot. So it's a fairly new term, one that it doesn't have a fixed reference. So a person conceptualize tech-secessionism not only as these extra statecraft activities of the tech elite, but also these forms of exit, individual exit that are technologically enabled and motivated. But at the same time, I also realize this is kind of an inadequate characterization. If you think about exit like this, and also ISIS is this tech-secessionist, ISIS for sure is also a secessionist project that's technologically enabled. So I think actually the talk that we're going to see from Nick Lan, it actually gives you can review for the video. Actually gives a very important addition to this conceptualization of tech-secessionism. Okay, so I'm just gonna introduce Nick Lan. So first of all, I'm really thankful that he did this. It was very difficult. Don't start yet. Yeah. Yeah. So it was very difficult actually to get any of the what I might call proponents of tech-secessionism or exit, as it's being discussed here, to join this discussion. I had many cancellations and very really kind of violent replies to these requests to talk. So I'm very thankful that Nick Lan agreed to do this. I think it's his first video presentation ever. I mean, he's based in Shanghai, so that's why there was a logistical difficulty to bringing him over. But so I just read his bio. For those who are not familiar with him. So Nick Lan is a British philosopher. He was a lecturer in continental philosophy from 1987 to 1999 at the University of Warwick, where he was also the faculty co-founder, along with Sadie Plan of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, better known as CCRU. He is the author of the Thirst for Annihilation, Georges Bataille and Virulent Nihilism, and Fanch Human collected writings 1987 to 2007, along with various articles on cybernetic culture. Lan has been described as one of the originators of the so-called Dark Enlightenment or neo-reactionary political movement.
In particular, its techno-commercialist strain. Currently, he is the author of 2 influential blogs, Outside In and Urban Future, as well as a recently published ebook, Complexity, Disorder Loops Through Shanghai Time. And without further ado, I've invited Andrea Crespo, born 1993, I just got the bios, in Miami, Florida, lives and works in New York. She'll finish the BFA at Pratt Institute in 2015. Her current special interests include neuropolitics, fandom roleplay culture, and cyber bodies/identities. Then Ed Keller, who's a director at the Center for Transformative Media at the New School, and associate professor at Parsons the New School for Design, design professor, writer, musician, and multimedia artist. With Carlo Leitao, he co-founded AUM Studio, an architecture new media firm that has produced residential projects, competitions, and new media installations in Europe and the US. Current research seminars at Parsons include post-planetary design. And then Geoff Manaugh, who's a freelance writer and curator based in Brooklyn, New York. He's the author of Building Block, an online catalog of spatial ideas and innovations at various scales and genres, from archaeology to urban planning, science fiction to geology. Manaugh is currently exploring the relationship between broderie and architecture for a new book forthcoming from Ferrara, Strauss, and Giroux. Welcome on stage.
We're going to have to project. Can you folks hear all the way in the back? If you can hear, yeah, cool. Okay, so we'll do our best to project.
Project. Yeah. Okay, of course, the Nick Land thing, which I assume is now being, like the sound is being fixed, that was also like a, let's say like an important part of the introduction to this talk. So, so maybe just like think like how can I skip certain terms that are like introduced to it in the talk. So maybe the slide with Ed. So like that is like an ultimate exit. What does it mean? Like it's like immediately associated with the idea of the frontier, like as we could see in some of these spaces that I like referred to earlier. So where could one like ultimately escape? Like if all the landmass of Earth has already been like occupied by a sovereign nation, are the seasteaders right? Is the only space on Earth we can essentially escape to, exit to like the oceans, or what about space? What is what are the available frontiers for us?
So before we convened today, I sent an image from a comic by Grant Morrison called "The Filth" to the other panelists. And some of you may or may not be familiar with this, but Morrison is a kind of an enfant terrible, although he's obviously not an enfant any longer, of the comic book writing world. And he's renowned perhaps for his masterwork, The Invisibles, but The Filth is a very interesting kind of meta-commentary, and one of the subplots in The Filth is actually something like a seasteading community on a vast ocean liner, which falls into a series of subplots of corruption and world dominance and interdimensional strife. Totally science fiction, of course. But one of the things that Morrison is doing is he's leveling a pretty savage critique at the entire concept that a secession would be possible at all, whether on this planet or off the planet. And I think that would be, even though it was circulated privately amongst us, almost as a joke or a provocation, I think it's an interesting place to start, because one wonders what one would secede from. And for me, the starting point, and I apologize that I'm speaking so loudly, but I just want to reach everybody in the back. The starting point would be what the model of the human really is, right? And so my critique of many of the arguments in favor of secession to the seas would be the image of the human that's offered as an image to save or as an image to extract from the corruptions of contemporary society is an extremely impoverished image of what humans are capable of in all of their rich varieties of life, to riff on William S. Burroughs a little bit. And So for me, that becomes the starting point of the question. What kind of human do we think is necessary or worthwhile to save? And where would we save them to? And how would we save them? And so again, if the image of the human is an almost Da Vincian, Vitruvian image of a man, a naked man articulating geometric principles of correctness, unquestioned, and then projected across a larger body of individuals, I personally take deep issue with that, right? Because that's such a simplistic and reductive image of what the capacity of the human is. And the city that we live in here is such a kind of a rebuttal to that simplistic notion of the human. So I guess I would bounce it back to the question of what we can say the city, or a city like New York, defines as human, what we can learn from that definition of human, and what we then can project in terms of legal structures, economic structures, structures of affect and desire, feedback loops which allow us to reconfigure what it means to be human, which then would allow us to start the discussion about secession. And then the only other thing I'll say to kick this off to the other panelists is, isn't secession a retreat from the most important work that needs to be done? And when we see that image of Silicon Valley's ultimate exit, it's a completely bald statement of an elite which thinks it can simply secede from the rest of humanity. And so the idea of an exit strategy, of course, in business models, is to say, we build it up to a certain level, and then we can offload risk and future work to a different population while we reap the rewards. And there are some other questions which I think will come up in this discussion having to do with the nature of capital, which I think then become extremely interesting to engage, both in terms of tech-secessionism, but also in terms of how contemporary cities, historically cities, and future cities function. And that, again, becomes a part of the discussion of secession. But I take an ethical umbrage, if you will, at the idea that the ultimate exit is something we should be arguing for. And so with that, I'll toss it to the other panelists.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about like what kind of motivations would drive maybe someone to want to exit in terms of like the body and affect and desire, and I think like transhumanism is like the obvious like I guess there would be avenues for transhumanism open outside of like these like Western state sovereignty system, like in terms of like what kinds of procedures will be performed, like what kinds of things will be allowed, human cloning, like all these sorts of things. And like transhuman desires are very much, from the research I've done, like very much like, you know, post-edible. They don't really like fit well with like these societies that are very much organized around like Bronze Age religion and stuff like that. So like, I think there's definitely like an impetus in terms of the transhuman.
So in the sense that the kind of structures of society that we understand right now prevent us from actually choosing our own structures of affect, basically.
Right, because they expect like there's certain demands for identity, certain demands for like subjecthood, like unitary subjecthood that's like functional and discrete. And of course, like a Seastead would be a perfect place for like a mad scientist in biotech to like perform the types of experiments they'd like to perform. The scarier side of it.
Well, yeah, I feel like there's a whole bunch of really interesting themes and
topics to discuss. I mean, I think that secession, for example, I think is only one example of what an exit would be. I mean, secession is a very particular geopolitical and geographic model of forming a polity that is not connected to the previous one, whereas I think exit can be something that is very temporary. It doesn't even necessarily need to be spatial. It can occur within an existing geopolitical unity. I mean, arguably, every time you go on an off-the-grid camping trip, you're sort of temporarily experiencing exit. There's a whole sort of suite of concepts that already exist that we could draw from there. There's the temporary autonomous zone. There's even just like tribalism. There's some really interesting examples. I mean, Martti mentioned sort of as if joking that ISIS is an example of exit or a new sort of political polity, but I think that even examples like that are worth kind of throwing into the conversation. But I guess specifically, because I feel like maybe to bring things back to architecture just really briefly, I think that what I think is interesting is that architecture, especially the avant-garde side of architecture that is constantly trying to twin spatial design with a political project, you do find very, very, very many projects that are trying to use architecture as a mode of political expression to either engineer a new society or to sort of bootstrap a new polity into existence. And so there are examples that go back throughout, I mean, all the way back to Utopia and before. But just to speak in terms of sort of, I guess, like my familiarity, I mean, there are some of the obvious examples of things like the walking city of Archigram. You've got, which has an enormous amounts of problems, but yet nonetheless kind of spectacularizes the notion of running away. But it is a very adolescent sort of model of, you know, we can build this fun sort of like yellow submarine that walks across the landscape and we can have an eternal party in it. Then there's, you know, obviously the super studio sort of vision of how architectural design might almost reformat the earth into a kind of, like a tabula rasa, an infinite white grid upon which all forms of experimental sexualities and experimental new micro communities can be formed. But then you've also got the Constance New Babylon, and I apologize that I'm just giving you a word salad of avant-garde projects, but what's interesting about Constance New Babylon is that it's pitched as this kind of ultimate user-friendly tech-secessionist space where it's a response to your every desire, a response to your every sexual need, a response to, you know, whether or not you want the temperature to go up or the temperature to go down. If you want water or music piped into your apartment, you can get anything you want. But I think that the irony of these kinds of deliberate avant-garde projects that are politically motivated is that a lot of times they accomplish the exact opposite of what they strove for. And I think that in the case of New Babylon, to borrow Henry Miller's phrase, it's basically just an air-conditioned nightmare. He's basically sort of came up with the American shopping mall 20 years ahead of time, or arguably not actually, but sort of you know, co-invented the American shopping mall vision and turned into this sort of hellish project that has no bearing on sort of liberal democratic principles. But so what's interesting though, and the reason why I mention all those is that those are political projects undertaken by architects that are meant to liberate the subject and to experience something like exit or like secession. But what I think is really interesting is that a lot of these are sort of feel-good examples, and that if you actually look at the dark side of tech-secessionism or the dark side of architectural innovation, you find people like the extraction industries who actually are the people who are physically engineering and designing the platforms in a very literal sense of the word platform that would be used by these same projects. So that's why you see Archigram, for instance, fetishizing military technology, fetishizing offshore oil rigs and oil platforms. But what's interesting about that is that not only are they technically able, when I say they, I mean the extraction industries, not only are they technically able and well capitalized enough that they can realize a seasteading like scenario, or they can realize a kind of offshore, you know, terra firma in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, is that they are very good at state evasion. And so the irony is that they sort of have already been perfecting tech-secessionism in a very minor degree, and they've been doing it for generations now. And they've been doing it through tax evasion, they've been doing it through regulation evasion, and it is in and of itself a kind of secession in plain sight. And so it's kind of a long-winded answer, but what I think is really interesting is that I guess there are pockets of secession that surround us at all times, and there are ways of exiting that we're constantly interacting with and that we ourselves have experienced, even if we didn't know that they were forms of exit at the time that we experienced them. And it's easy to overlook those because they don't have the big flags of, say, a Silicon Valley VC entrepreneur saying, you know, putting a stamp on this, or it's not Burning Man where you've got 10,000 other people surrounding you and suddenly you're in Newsweek. But there are these little sort of minor events of secession that I think are really quite important. And maybe I'll save some other stuff for a later answer, but I think it's really important to recognize that those pockets, those moments, because after all, exit can be temporary. Exit can be 5 minutes. Exit can be 10 seconds. Exit can be a kind of almost like a petit mot or something where you it doesn't last very long, but nonetheless, you have experienced a form of secession. So in any case, I think it's really interesting how the temporalities of getting away overlap with the spatiality of getting away, and then where architects often very, very misleadingly try to frame that for an avant-garde project that will never be fulfilled.
I would say that there's already been successful seasteaders, like in terms of like how Foucault describes like the ship of fools, which is where like they would just put mentally ill people, you know, in the early Renaissance, and they would just let them sail around like Europe, and that was a seastead. It was like a temporary kind of autonomous zone where you know, there was no reason, like the you know, the operational rules of society weren't there. And it's interesting that they existed because they existed, well, seasteads are almost defined by almost like their own, the subject's own inhumanism. So I think there is like historical precedence for.
Well, even just think of the news right now. I mean, like the sort of the dark news that has been emerging over the last 48 hours is the CIA torture report. And I think that one of the most extraordinary things there is that you say the ship of fools, but like we, the American polity, the American taxpayer who funded this and who voted in the president and the vice president and his legal counsels who underwrote it, have effectively created sort of ships of fools on land. And so they're these like, you know, they're the islands in Martti's sense of they're just sort of these isolated enclaves. But where we did define a kind of subhuman, we put them into islands that were these secret prisons that are, I mean, in and of itself are just sort of terrifying to see a satellite vision of a secret prison in Afghanistan. But so that's where we did put the subhuman. They were the humans in Ed's term who weren't worth saving, or they're the sort of the ship of fools on land that we lock away in these places that, geographically speaking, don't exist. You know, they've almost succeeded from the earth. So I feel like it's really interesting, a news cycle that coincides with the event that we're doing now, to sort of see how not only tech-secessionism can go wrong, but even the desire for exit can have extraordinarily negative political connotations for the people who don't get to exit with you.
So yeah, I don't want to. I mean, I still assume we're going to see the neglect thing. So I don't want to like paraphrase it too much. But basically, like in his talk, he makes this like distinction, or he brings up like the third term from this the Hirschman book that introduces this idea of exit voice, which is loyalty, which is something that's kind of being like ignored, and like his the kind of point he's making is that like loyalty is in the fact the kind of the most like in a way like the most important factor like in this like most of exit, and he makes this like distinction between hot collectives and cold collectives, like hot collectives being collectives that are built around like a meta narrative such as like a religion, that is like an ethnicity, a nation state, like what have you, and cold collectives, or like in a way like the cold exit, like which would like have like zero loyalty, would be something that's like economically motivated, that has no ties to kind of like meta narrative. That's like maybe if you think of the place, like an existing place, you could say like Singapore, like would be like as a state, like Singapore, maybe like the closest you can get to like a hot a cold collective. So would you like, I mean, just like using this like terminology, and I mean like you can make claim that the like CIA, the kind of like torture dungeons or the like those islands, they're very, I mean they're very much like premise of this like conflict between like two hot, very hot collectives, and that's also like why I kind of like mentioned like why like ISIS would of course be this kind of again like a boiling hot like a collective, or like a hot mode of exit. But like if you think about this idea of the cold, like of a cold like cold exit, like a space or a structure, or like an exit that's purely let's say like economically or technologically motivated. Like would you identify? I mean, like also like think about the inhuman. are you able to make this distinction, or would you?
The idea of the hot collectivity and the cold collectivity is interesting. I guess I would pick up where Geoff was speaking a moment ago about both utopian and avant-garde architectural and urban projects, but also maybe the project of modernity, high modernity, starting maybe after World War I in general. And one could make the argument that the entire project of high modernity was to achieve a degree zero language in both local form and in distributed and general form. In other words, both local design, product design, industrial design, but also urban design, such that there would be a flattening of those collectivities from hot collectivities into neutral or cold collectivities. And to use the degree zero language quite specifically, that it effectively would encourage humans in general to exit from their previous strong cultural affiliations and reinvent themselves. Now, I admit that that's maybe a slightly eccentric reading of high modernism or a personal reading on my part, but let's just take that for a second. Then what we would have to do is we'd have to look at the design moves made by architects and urban designers who calculated precisely at the scale that they were implementing their designs what kind of collectivity would be formed by that particular design move. If you want to talk about Corbusier and Chandigarh, et cetera, right? Then you can say, how was the architect, the designer, and of course the implications of colonialism playing out there, Corbin in Chandigarh, Algiers, etc. Totally, we can dive down into that. But the design move there presumably was calculated to implement a form of cold collectivity through an infrastructural and an urban scale, with the agenda being the achievement of a different form of humanism, if you will. A modern form of humanism, or a neutral or a empathetic form of humanism. And again, I'm making an extremely generous and possibly eccentric reading of both someone like Corbusier and high modernism. But I feel like that would be a starting point. Now, the next question would be, what other systems are operating that work to enforce or facilitate, afford this range of collectivities that Nick Lamb is talking about? Genetics work to facilitate a range of collectivities. Structures of affect and desire work to facilitate those. So for me, as thinking as a design theorist, I have to be asking that question specifically all the time. What design moves will facilitate those kind of collectivities? And, you know, Robin Hanson, who is an economist and a former astrophysicist, who has written in this space quite a bit, tries to think this out literally on an off-planet level. And I think even though we're talking about urbanisms, it's worth noting this because the design thinking that he's talking about could apply on a planetary scale, on a terrestrial scale. I'll read you a brief passage from Robin Hanson. This text is titled The Rapacious Hardscrabble Frontier. And the backstory of this text is he's effectively trying to think about what kind of cultural structures, what kind of technological, legal, and cultural structures would be necessary for humans to maintain a cohesive cultural or political structure if they were on deep space voyages over literally thousands or tens of thousands of years or longer. So that's the context. We're not talking about the design of a city which will work for 100 years or 1,000 years. We're talking about a deep space mission which would be tens of thousands of years or longer. This is what he says. How our descendants act in this situation will depend not only on the physical and technical constraints they face, but also on their personalities. That is, their strategies, goals, plans, and other behavioral tendencies. The answer depends on how strongly our descendants coordinate their behavior during a crucial era. The familiar biological world contains only local coordination. Genes can coordinate within a body, and creatures can coordinate within a tribe, but on larger scales, genes, creatures, and tribes compete for scarce resources with little coordination. So he's basically setting up the problem, like, how do genes coordinate already effectively, and then at what scale do they cease to coordinate? How do tribes coordinate effectively, and at what scale do they cease to coordinate? And then he's extrapolating out to something much longer than the time frame we usually consider, to ask the question, you know, what will be the techne that's necessary to coordinate if we are intending to coordinate not just for a decade or a century or a millennia, but for much, much longer periods of time? And I think that Nick Land is thinking about this quite directly, because he's thinking about the exit problem through acceleration that humanity is going to face in the next 2 to 5 decades. But it does plug back into these questions of both the avant-garde and utopian examples that Geoff was raising. It does plug back into the questions of high modernism, because that was in some way an explicit goal of high modernist urban design on a planetary scale. And it also does plug back into the kind of local structures of affect points that you were raising, in the sense that we're trying to design enclaves which will permit, maybe, again, as Geoff was saying, anyway, this is the hypothesis I'll throw back to you folks, maybe even the opportunity for an exit which lasts a minute, 5 minutes, as well as a century, a millennia, or longer.
Well, I mean, in those scenarios, I think you could imagine as well like a rhythm of exit that would potentially, might last 5 minutes and then go into stasis and then come back, and et cetera, and you would experience moments of kind of punctuated equilibrium of exits that appear throughout historic time into the future. But I do think it's interesting, just briefly, almost as a counter, the thing I was thinking about when you were talking was that I do think it's interesting that the notion of sort of deep time secessionism or a deep time exit, that it's predicated on, I don't know, how can I even say this? Like, if we're talking about speciesism and genes and that kind of thing, I guess I just wonder, like, what is the exit for a mule? Like, if a mule is that which cannot reproduce, and as a man who doesn't want children, like, what does that mean? Like, what is either the community that you strive to join, or how does this thing that doesn't reproduce experience exit? And does exit have to be long term? That's right. I guess we can, you know, an event next year called Mule Secessionism.
I think that what you were talking about, like genes, personality types, is very closely related to like what's happening in Silicon Valley now, where it seems like the STEM industries are selecting for certain neurotypes, in the sense that it selects for certain types of autistics, so not just autistic people in general, but like the type who shows like proclivities towards like numbers and technical things in general, and this doesn't reflect all autism, of course, but it's I think like a good example to bring up is Justine Tunney, who is a autistic transsexual who works for Google, and she is a neo-reactionary. She like hangs out in the same parts of cyberspace as land, and she'll write things like, "Oh, the nerds have made this new tech world that needs to be separate from like the neurotypical world." Neurotypicals are like people with normal neurological functioning, as far as like that's been defined by like psychiatric discourse. But you know, it's an opposition that exists in popular culture, like the Asperger's archetype is very much depicted. So she talks about like secession in terms of like the nerds getting away and being able to host certain forms of like cult collectivity, like because they just don't get angry in the same way, or they won't, you know, they navigate things socially differently. So it, you already see some kind of like narrow type secessionism, like belief that we're already a different type of human, and we're also better with like this new technology, or better fitted for like the environments, for like cybernetic environments, which the neurotypicals are not. And obviously this becomes very problematic because you're already creating a hierarchy. But I think that the neurotype hierarchy is something that's very much like present in Silicon Valley tech culture. Just like the belief that there's like this biological barrier between like the techie and the neurotypical.
Do you think it's also like reflected in the, let's say, like the spatial imaginary of the?
Yeah, I mean, of secessionism.
Yeah, or like or this like specific breed.
Yeah, well, again, like I said, when I speak of narrow atypicality, I can't speak of like all narrow atypicals or neurodivergent people. I'm speaking of like a very particular type, like the libertarian, techie type person that these ideologies sort of select for, and like I think there's like a propensity to like want to be alone or be okay with being alone. So like seclusion definitely is something that like isn't this like people would think of that as a constraint maybe for like most people, like the seclusion, but depending on neurotype it might actually not be an issue. It might be a plus, and also like I mean even the sensory qualities of the spaces are probably going to be very different from like spaces, I guess, designed for like abled neurotypicals and stuff.
I mean, for me, this brings up the whole question of what is a neurotypical anyway. And I think that our definition of that has limited us extraordinarily historically because great injustice has been done to people who were deemed by any dominant culture at any one time to be atypical. Whether it was gender identity or racial identity or religious preference, etc. I mean, human history is basically just a devastating charnel house of humans who considered themselves typical, doing things to people who they considered, non-typical. And so, the first response I have there is to simply say, gosh, can't we just all get along on some level? But it's funny because one of my favorite authors right now is a Canadian science fiction writer named Peter Watts. And he's written some extremely dark and extremely intelligent work trying to imagine what the relatively near future of humans will be. And one of the subplots in two of his recent novels is that humans resurrect a gene line which has been lost effectively. And the gene line happens to be a vampire gene line. Now, he actually, in his like afterward to the novel, he basically he confesses like I really wanted to do the vampire thing, but he also is trained as a marine biologist. He's a scientist, and he spends dozens of pages in his afterword explaining how it could be or could not be plausible. But the very funny thing is the vampires in his novels are extremely high functioning savant sociopaths. They absolutely are just pattern recognition monsters. Like, they are phenomenally good. They are so far above neurotypical, even augmented humans, that they're the key to leading the spaceship in the first novel, and they're the key to literally the, not to give away too much, but a planetary scale cataclysm in the second novel. Echopraxia, yeah. And basically what he does, though, it's brilliant. At one moment, there's a line right, and this won't give away too much, but there's a line right at the end of Echopraxia where one vampire speaking to the desert and to a human who is definitely no longer neurotypical for a lot of reasons, she says, "Why can't we all just get along?" And then something very terrible happens, and you don't really understand who she was talking to, but he gives you a little bit of a hint. It was really to the other vampires who were all competing for the same resource, human blood. And the predator-prey model that Watts plays out in Blindside and Echopraxia, it's very clear. The reason vampires could sleep for hundreds of years is because, of course, if a vampire feeds on humans, humans don't reproduce fast enough, so you can't get like a wolf to sheep, predator to prey cycle. Vampires eat a lot, the humans are all gone. Either the vampires die off, or evolutionarily they have to adapt, and the adaptation they come up with is kind of like a lungfish. They can go to sleep for decades, if not centuries. So Peter Watts is making a lot of really funny jokes, right? But he's actually playing constantly with the idea of the neurotypical and the neuro-advanced, or the transhuman, or the post-human, or the resurrected pre-human, which then becomes the radically transhuman or post-human. And honestly, the conclusions he comes to are, for me, frighteningly possible. I don't know about the resurrected vampire gene lines, but most of the other ones are frighteningly possible. But the other thing that I find really beautiful in blindsight and in echopraxia, even though it's like terrifying, is the fact that he doesn't really, no one is neurotypical. None of his characters, even the normal, quote, normal humans, are not neurotypical. And so the politics that play out, that he insists we will play out in the next few decades, are politics which have to be based on a much more radically diverse neurotypical landscape, or the absence of any kind of typicality. And so to me, that's a very interesting challenge, because what we could effectively say is we could say, well, no, he's wrong, we won't actually go that way. But at least the lesson that I would like to take from it, or that I would offer as a hypothesis, is actually what he's doing is he's saying that we haven't ever really been neurotypical. And maybe one way of reframing the way that we look at ourselves now, not in a science fiction scenario, but just totally normal, everyday life, is that none of us is neurotypical. Even if we all fit within a kind of a bell curve of behavioral patterns and structures of affect and belief systems, we're none of us neurotypical. And so that would be a starting point for me in terms of the secessionism or the exit question. Because one of the things that I'm terrified by in the discourse around the exit is the fact that some will identify themselves as more neuroatypical and yet more powerful than others. And some, yeah, please.
I mean, the thing is that, like, there's a lot of people who will say, well, neurotypicality is a construction, like, it's a label, and even some disabled people will use that kind of language. But the thing is, like, I think there's something very, like, iatrogenic about it. It's almost like your body's, like, so imbricated in these, like, discourses that you end up making it, like, more real, or, like, society will make it real. Like I feel like right now there's, like, almost like people know how to spot neuroatypicals better, because on television there's the comedic Asperger's character now, typically like very male brain and stuff. So it's like the divisions are usually not even made by themselves. It's almost like an abuse thing, with like Justine's tirades against like the neurotypical hot collective type humans is, it's largely based on her own, personal conflicts, as like a trans autistic person who just doesn't want to deal with the world anymore. So it's like, it does become this like personal, maybe even like adolescent thing. And like so many forms of exit exist for like neurotypicality as it is. Like there are the identity categories that exist in echopraxia already exist on the internet as like these very removed communities, like multiple identity, animal identity, cyborg identity, etc., etc. So it's like the neurotypicals do exclude, and there is repercussions. Land actually wrote this really funny post about like hominid social dynamics are like the hubris, but technological progress is the nemesis, because he kind of made this little hierarchy, or this little like, tried to draw this like feedback loop where the people who like fail in like neurotypical social hierarchy tend to be the ones who through technology become like stewards of capital, which is something that is very much like Silicon Valley, not a paper belt thing, which is all about social clout and stuff like that. But it's almost like it's just like playing into like the stereotype of like the bully who now works for the boss, because the boss has access to these like other ontologies that aren't like being on the top of the social ladder and stuff.
I wonder if the capacity humans have for repression and violence was muted, terminated, stripped away, medically stopped, would there still be a drive to classify difference? Or maybe in a related question, if we weren't competing for resources, if we didn't have millions of years of engineering built into us to be hungry and thirsty, would we still have those drives for classification? I wonder, because Neil Stephenson played this out in his novel The Diamond Age, where we live in a post-scarcity world, but there are still quite distinct class structures and cultural structures and affiliations. He imagines a future like that.
Yeah, like in Diamond Age, like it's particularly the somehow like the idea of a culture, like rather than like specific like like for example in Euro type of those like cultures would like strive on or reproduce that are the kind of driving force of force of exit or these. I think now those countries there's like this the feed and the file PHYLE. Which are kind of these tribal units that the world is like divided in. I'm like thinking about this. Like thinking about this idea of like the scramble for resources. Like, is this something like is it like this the kind of selection mechanism that the one would associate with the like a hot collectivity, like some kind of like meta narrative, like a nationalist meta narrative. Is that because that allows that's efficient in terms of like getting access to resources, like whereas to me this like idea of cold collectivity of like cold exit is somehow purely premised on like a calculative relationship to acquiring resources. As an individual, like rather than as part of as a culture.
I'd say I don't know. I think that the urge to exit isn't necessarily motivated by sort of greed or hoarding resources. And I think that there was an interesting example this is a random example, but in Florida about 11 months ago, a woman was fined by the state for actually trying to live off the grid, and she was actually mandated to reattach her house to the state electrical grid. So obviously in that very limited specific case of kind of electrical secessionism, this is an attempt to sort of actually consume less, maybe even feed back to the grid if you have generated enough power through solar and wind and et cetera, and being forced back into the polity. But I don't know, I think maybe I want to tie things back to architecture if I can, because I just want to make sure that that's still part of the conversation. A story not a story, but a thing I just wanted to bring up was that for a variety of reasons, a couple years ago I started getting really into reading the memoirs of retired police officers, and it was for the book that, I don't know if that was clear in the intro or whatever, but I'm writing a book about burglary, and so how do burglars relate to the built environment. But so I got really interested in how police look at the city, and how do they write about the city, how do they write about architecture when a policeman retires, and it is mostly men who are writing these biographies and memoirs. What is it that they remember about the mean streets, about the housing projects, et cetera, and how do they describe them, and is there something to that language? But what was really interesting is that, and specifically in New York City, when effectively very large-scale New York City housing projects were kicked off, simultaneous with the construction of large-scale housing units for the underprivileged and the poor, essentially, was the inauguration of a whole new police force, the housing authority, or the housing police, excuse me. And so what's really interesting about that is that, and it's a built typology, a building actually requires a whole new form of police in order to control, surveil, and effectively kind of colonize it. But what's also interesting then, especially in some of these police memoirs, is that you realize is that the police themselves felt as if the architecture was so complex and yet so monotonous that they never knew where they were, and they'd get lost. They wouldn't be able to call up backup. They actually would develop like acoustic signals for when they have to do the stair surveys. I can't remember it's like stair patrol. I can't remember the exact phrase.
Vertical patrol.
Yeah, exactly. Vertical patrols in the housing. So they would develop sort of a baton-based tapping to let each other know that they were all right. And then again, this was actually just back in the news because the vertical patrols that resulted in someone being shot in the darkness who was unarmed again. But so what's interesting about this is that the state then is responding to one of its own architectural types by inaugurating a police force to then patrol the architecture that it itself has created. And yet at the same time, the irony of that is that this is meant to be, especially amongst a certain political class, public housing is meant to be the paragon of sort of helpless, suckling on the teat of the state. Sort of you're relying on the state to give you everything, whereas what's actually happening seems to be the exact opposite of that, which is that it's like a one-time gift. You get these very large structures and you can live in them, but beyond that, even the police don't even know how to find you, how to help you, and would now respond with overwhelming force precisely because they're so confused and don't know how to meander through these hallways. And so the reason why I mention that is because the flip side of exit isn't necessarily, that's an active thing. That implies that we together decide to leave a place. But the other side of that is abandonment, dereliction, or being left behind. Unfortunately, left behind now is sort of like a code word for the rapture. I'm not going to get into that. But what does it mean for an entire political class, an entire social class, even just an entire demographic group to be left behind by the state in this sort of one-off gift offer of public housing, and then responding to that very act of generosity by creating a police force to patrol it? I think there's a really interesting sort of there's a weird sort of fable of modern power and architecture and the state tied up in that. And there also is that notion then that you don't need to necessarily pick up and go in order to exit. You can stay exactly where you were and simply be left behind by everyone around you. And so what does it mean then to almost be the sort of, the forced exit, to be jettisoned, to be asked to leave, to be forgotten? I think that's another really interesting aspect of this conversation. And it also has a specific architectural type, at least in Western urbanism. But even that, actually, excuse me, like think of another thing that's sort of like a cult classic amongst architecture bloggers is the Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong, which is also like a totemic vision of the feral city for sci-fi writers as well. But if you don't know what it is, the Kowloon Walled City was this unbelievably complex sort of ad hoc development in Hong Kong, an extraordinarily populous city. And yet, at the same time, through its labyrinthine nature, was basically free from state oversight. Cops wouldn't want to go into it. They didn't necessarily even have jurisdiction over it, which is half the reason it was still there. And yet, through architecture, you sort of inadvertently engineered a political scenario. And so that's another thing that I think is interesting, is that architects tend to think that they can design something like this, like the Corbusian sort of parametric politics that you were describing. Architects assume that they can know how a building is going to be used, and they almost never can assume how, or they're almost always wrong. And so I think it's really interesting that, in fact, architecture can come into the world and then find its polity, or it can, and I don't know why I'm using that word so much tonight, but it can find the people who respond to it or use it politically. And I think that's also extremely interesting. And so the Kowloon Walled City, public housing, et cetera, it's how exit takes architectural form is something that is I think worth discussing.
Well, I mean, I mentioned Corb's plan for Algiers earlier, and immediately the way that you're describing, what you were just describing, made me think of Pontecorvo's film Battle of Algiers. And there's a very specific shot that I always remember from that film, which is precisely about the Algerian resistance to the French. And it's a very interesting and weird film because one of the stars in the film is actually someone who was a member of the resistance, who was involved in putting the entire film project together. And ultimately, when Pontecorvo produced the film, it went from being a sensationalization of the resistance to being something that was much more almost like a neorealist reconstruction of what happened. And it's very interesting as an artifact, as a piece of cinema on that level, because for two reasons. One, Yes, this person was a member of the resistance. Yes, it does reconstruct events. It takes a very interesting neutral position on both the Algerian and the French tactics and strategies, even though it clearly is ultimately in support of the Algerian resistance. But the other thing that sets it up as a very unusual artifact is the fact that not only did it create fire bombings of theaters and was forbidden in France immediately upon release, but it ultimately became both a terrorist training manual and a counterinsurgency training manual that was used to train people how to conduct insurgencies and bombings. Also used in counterinsurgency projects in the United States and in Europe to show trainees how to prepare to deal with terrorist attacks and insurgencies. So anyway, the film has this very interesting status, but there's one shot in it just before the French send troops into the old quarter in the city, where the camera's positioned up in the old quarter, and it does this incredible zoom out across the entire city, down into a piazza or a square, which, if I remember correctly, is either on the edge or in the French quarter, where the troops are massing. And then you get this, apparently something that influenced George Lucas and his Star Wars treatment, showing stormtroopers. You get this, influx of the French troops into the much more diffuse body or fabric of the city, conducting their house-to-house searches, et cetera, et cetera. And that moment of the cinematic zoom precisely captures the disorder of one kind of urban fabric, one kind of mode of living, one kind of mode, I keep using the term structures of affect, but one set of structures of affect of being to another, links them together, and then shows how this mode of control then crosses the border, infiltrates, and starts carrying out its work. And I think that, for me, again, that particular cinematic zoom is an incredible highlight to illustrate those two different kinds of modes of power and what's maybe at stake in what you're talking about. But also, I keep thinking of Kowloon Walled City, and I always conflate some of Wong Kar-wai's films and the intimacy that he shows his characters in the city, experiencing the city through and experiencing each other through. And so there was this very specific subjective range of potential structures of affect and connection with each other that are related to the urban fabric, but are still, on some level, completely independent from it. So people still have freedom in whatever urban fabric they're participating in, regardless of the degree of control that the urban fabric actually attempts to enforce.
And then just briefly too, another thing I wanted to mention, and I looked at this right before I came out again just to verify that it was as weird as I remembered. But it's actually considered by many people to be the sort of the #1 terrorist threat in the United States, which is actually sovereign citizens, which is this really bizarre movement that when you first hear about it, it sounds like, okay, sure, it's the ranchers who don't want to pay tax and are very much into gun rights and that kind of thing. But it's actually it's so interesting. If you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center and just look up sovereign citizens, the write-up is insane. It almost sounds like if you can imagine Thomas Pynchon and an occult-minded anti-taxer getting together and coming up with the most insane theory of government imaginable, that's the sovereign citizen movement. So it's not just people that want to live off the grid who want to sort of fulfill a kind of type A masculinity with giant buck knives and shotguns and living out of making their boots out of deer hide, that kind of thing. It's this insane theory actually that your social security number, and in fact actually I'm not even going to do this theory justice, but I'll try. Your social security number is actually kind of a transaction code that the US government has made with its future creditors. And that when you're born, either, and it depends apparently, depending on which sovereign citizen you're talking to, either it's $600,000 or $20 million is deposited in your name in that account. And that, and also, whenever you look at your driver's license or your birth certificate or any official record of you, when your name is in all capital letters, that's the name of a shell corporation that corresponds to that bank account. And so I'm going to tell you, I'll give you the number about how many people believe this, by the way. It's nuts. And so anyway, whenever you get official documentation and it's your name in lowercase, then it's your actual name. And so that now it gets into this Scientological Thomas Pynchonian stuff where they've come up with these quasi-legal hand-waving things about using red ink and writing things down on receipts that for them constitutes a breaking of the transaction. And in fact, this is like the Scientology thing. So it sort of separates the lowercase name, lowercase Jeff, from uppercase Jeff, who is actually a shell corporation. and et cetera, et cetera. So there are 500,000 sovereign citizens in the United States, and many of them are heavily armed, and also like theorize themselves as being beyond speeding tickets, beyond any form of tax. And so what's also funny is that, and this is like I genuinely find this amusing actually, which is that when they receive a tax bill or when they receive like a summons from the government, et cetera, they respond with like overwhelming quantities of paperwork. And so it's literally gotten to the point where you cannot respond to this amount of like counter responses in the paperwork that is involved. And so they're starting to find basically that courts literally cannot keep up with the load, and so are passing on some of these people, which they're taking as victory, which sort of, validates the sort of infinite paperwork approach to sovereignty. And so they basically have these theories that you can't tax, et cetera, but so that's a kind of exit without going anywhere. And so it's and that's a very, very prominent thing amongst U.S. culture. And so what's interesting about that in particular is that it combines the kind of like frontier Fremont sort of rugged, outdoors Western escape kind of attitude of U.S. culture, especially of kind of a masculine U.S. culture, but with this really strange sci-fi government conspiracy kind of view. And then also, just briefly too, I just think it's really interesting that everyone on different sides of the political spectrum appears to be looking for a secession and an exit right now. And so you see everything from like parts of Vermont wanting to secede and become Canadian. You see Colorado is looking into splitting so that the more rural and conservative parts of Colorado will have a separate state. You see the 6 Californians plan that obviously is part of the whole Tech-Secessionism thing. But then there's also West California and internal California, which was an earlier model of secession. But then the one that I think is really interesting and that I just think it would be worth following on is actually is another very far right-wing fantasy. It's territorial fantasy. It's called the American Readout, however you say that word. And it's basically that all conservatives who truly believe in the sort of do-it-yourself, state-free version of livelihood should be moving to the mountain states. And it's very particular mountain states. Like, don't move to Colorado. This is their official thing. Because Colorado is now full of expatriate Californians, and they brought their kind of liberal big city ways to Colorado. So Colorado is gone. But you can still move to Utah, Western, but not the rest of South Dakota, North Dakota. Anyway, sorry, you don't need the whole list for me. But so it's this mountains to us again. Sure, and then we're ready to read it. But so the notion of moving to this internal escape valve for the ultra right obviously has its own sort of mirror image and escape valves for the left, etc. But it's just totally fascinating how many people are looking for escape and secession.
And it really like mirrors like you think about these like standard like cyberpunk tropes. For example, like the world of Snow Crash, or which is kind of like also like the world of Diamond Age. I mean, this kind of like a vague reference to how like this nation-state system collapsed, and it was like actually like the technology that resembles Bitcoin, like somehow like a cryptocurrency made taxation essentially impossible. And this is something that broke down the state system, and then like you ended up with this kind of archipelago of enclaves and city-states and kind of corporately run, like a patchwork of corporately run microstates.
I think isn't Stevenson's term for it franchulate?
Yeah.
It's a combination of consulate and franchise.
Yeah, or verb clave.
Verb clave.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the Idaho castle secession?
Is it like the Michael Anisimov thing?
Yes, Michael Anisimov is like a neo-reactionary, so and he's because he's neo-reactionary, it's like he has his like techno-commercialist motivations, but he's also like very much wanting to ally himself with that kind of demographic, like of the frontiersmen, especially because there's like a lot of faith and like alpha-ness and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So like that's part of the neurotype, I guess like cosmology. But this actually, even though it's like supported by these like by a futurist as a way to kind of weather some kind of collapse, like violent outcome of that. It goes back to like making the space like a fort, like made out of stone, like a straight up castle designed. Yeah, I mean, there's a website and there's designs, and you know, it would have like walls and maybe a moat and kind of like pretty much like a medieval style layout.
It's interesting. I find that very weird because I read Anisimov's blog for a number of years, and he would post some very interesting things. When I say that, I don't mean the politically minded things. I mean simply tracking tech developments and speculating on tech developments. And it seems like building a stone castle in Idaho misses out on all of the things that could happen around castles that the past 2 millennia have shown people can do to castles. You know, so that's remarkable. I don't know, just as a side note, this movement that you were just talking about and this particular phenomenon makes me take great, I don't know, faith or feel some kind of satisfaction and relief in the existence of the Insane Clown Posse and the Juggalo movement, right? No, because isn't there some kind of like just raw, almost surreal jouissance in that as opposed to this manic belief of a conspiracy? And also, you know, someone once handed me a red pen to sign a credit card receipt, and they looked at me with deep meaning. So did that actually mean that?
Okay, actually, yeah, I think it's kind of time to go into the Q&A part of this this night.
You know, this architectural and the social biological exit that's been discussed, it's so exclusive and basically it's, well, by definition, it's a way of excluding everyone else. This is, you know, happening on all fronts. But one of the more interesting projects that I've seen come out of Silicon Valley and the utopian, you know, billionaire endeavors is this Long Now Foundation. And, you know, you brought up this idea of a temporal exit. And to me, that project fits here, but somehow it's also very inclusive in that none of us, or all of us, are participating in it if we choose. And I'm just wondering, where does that temporal, how does that temporal exit work into this? It's not something that occurred to me when I heard about the talk tonight, but it came up, and I think for the you know, Stuart Brand and the guys working on that project, it's like the only real kind of exit we can have, because it is collective.
I mean, I really appreciated the other panelists' take on different temporalities and kind of individual and collective responses to exit. I have a specific thought about that precise example that you just brought up. It does seem to be motivated by people who have at heart an interest in preserving what they deem to be the most important parts of humanity, and registering a kind of a timeline or a metric, providing a metric for that continuum. And that's a very interesting project. You know, I recently read a pretty strong critique of the film Interstellar. I think it was in Jacob and Mag. I just read it, you know, maybe yesterday morning, arguing that it's a radically, in a way, colonialist, Americanist, anthropocentric notion of human intelligence going out into the universe and basically being, you know, the saviors. I mean, 5-dimensional entities that live in black holes still need humans to come float around in their little 3-dimensional constructs to send messages back through bookshelves and dust, you know. And on some level, you know, yes, Interstellar was beautiful, but it was extremely flawed on that level for me. I think that the question of, however, getting a certain bit of humanity off planet or preserving it in some way is maybe what's at stake for the Long Now Foundation. And that's something that I find very interesting. If you've seen Interstellar, you know that one subplot is this kind of battle between some scientists who know that the mission is doomed to failure, and they know that all they're really doing is finding a place where they can seed humanity with a few thousand embryos that are frozen, versus some of the other scientists who actually think they're on a mission to, rescue the entire planet. And I don't think that the film plays the tension out between those two positions particularly well, because they're both very interesting positions. And because it's actually possible and indeed likely that the Earth will suffer during humanity's existence a planet-killing strike, asteroid strike, it makes sense for us to get off planet. That's my position, and it's a lot of people's positions. It's probably Elon Musk's position. It's probably people who would fit into the tech-secessionist and exit communities position. But I actually think it's a very interesting position, and I would defend that position because the likelihood of it happening is real. So if it's real, in Nick Bostrom at the Future for Humanity Institute over in England, people he worked with, like Hansen, who's been a fellow there, they all consider these problems of substantial planetary existential risk. And so that becomes independent of whether one thinks that one's image is the image worth saving, or a specific alpha image is the image of humanity worth saving. That project in general is a really interesting project for me. And so when you mentioned Long Now Foundation, that's one of the things I think of, is that it seems to be in alignment with an attempt to save somehow an encompassing, inclusive, empathic best of humanity, and that's a project that I think is worth getting behind. I don't think there's a fanaticism there that I catch, whiffs of from the radical libertarian secessionists who see themselves as independent from all humanity. Does that kind of take on the issue that you're raising?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just mainly preoccupied with how sad it is for the rest of us when there's a succession of, we're left behind. So it doesn't matter if it's the sovereign citizens going to the mountains or whatever, but, we're outside. But then if it's a temporal proposition, which the long now, as I understand it, is, we're talking about the unit of time that's outside of our normal comprehension, 10,000 years. None of us are there for it. So are we there? Are we included in their plans? I think so, because it's a capsule, right? And so I think that I wanted to bring it up as a kind of a counterpoint as maybe an inclusive exit or an exit from time. And it's a little bit different than the architectural exits we think about, or the biological and social.
There's one other concept that is worth mentioning in this context: the concept of a funeral pyre beacon. And some of you maybe know this concept, but a funeral pyre, of course, is burning the body. But a funeral pyre beacon is a concept of an advanced, technologically highly advanced civilization that recognizes it's at its senescence, and it builds a beacon that will last for millions of years. To simply say to any other civilization that might stumble by, we were here, this is what we did. And this is a project which is thinking much longer than the 10,000-year clock project, but is in the same spirit. It's effectively saying, well, what's worth saving? We could say, is an individual human worth saving, or are we simply phenotypical instantiations of a much larger genotype project, which is really the place where the information is happening. It's not me and you.
So you like funeral pyre beacons and five-dimensional black hole creatures. You should really read Diaspora by Greg E. Takes that to the ultimate limit.
It's sitting on my shelf, actually.
If you're interested in biological secession, you should talk to my company, MetaMan. We can do a lot of things that people read about in science fiction for real, from genetic engineering to resculpting people's bodies to tissue engineering. Like we have customers and it works. Lots of different things work. And for everyone, leaving people behind. I've heard a lot of people critique the colonization of America for, imperialism and genocide and slavery and all sorts of things. But I've never heard the colonization of America critiqued for the vicious immigrants who left behind the poor Europeans to fend for themselves within the dirt and filth of Europe. I've never heard the Jews who fled the Spanish Inquisition criticized for leaving behind the Spanish to starve without a banking system, which is what they in fact did. The idea of criticizing people for imperialism seems to speak fairly strongly against universalism and inclusion. But the idea of criticizing people for leaving behind, it's not clear what that could, in principle, not speak out against. Does anyone have any takes on that?
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think that it's but I guess I'd say that my own reaction to that is that it's just a really wishy-washy sort of thing, which is that exit isn't necessarily a good or bad thing either way. It depends on who's doing it and why. I mean, it could be, for example, you could be exiting because you know that a tragedy is about to hit the earth and you don't want to tell people, so you take off. It could be that I know, somebody's going to come and burn down my family's house tonight, so I don't tell my parents, and I set out, to exit and leave them to sort of face the blaze, which would be a sort of immoral exit, as it were. And it depends on what those parents have done to me. So, I mean, you get into a whole very strange category there. But so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's the morals of, there are people who are left behind, there are the people who secede, there are the people who flee versus the people who just sort of like go off on a Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and just want to go sort of experience the cosmos. Like, I guess I just feel like the morals and the ethics and the critique of these projects is so local and so specific on that exact moment of secession that I just think, so that's a long-winded way of saying, I agree with you. Like, the examples you gave would be quite strange to critique those people for, like, he should have stayed and suffered. I think that would be a very strange thing to say, but there are exactly the opposite scenarios where you could imagine that someone is in fact abandoning people or leaving under politically and ethically dubious narrative terms.
Yeah, and
so
there's also like a point that Hirschman makes in the book, or like somehow that the book is premised on this idea that exit has privileged position in the American experience, exactly because of that, because like America, as we know, the United States, as we know it now, is built upon these like millions and millions, or like millions of individual exits. I mean, and that's somehow it's at the core of the sort of American experience.
But I also think that you would have to critique the very human, like blindly human narrative, which makes people believe that they have exited something. And I think this is maybe where I agree and also maybe disagree with the point that you raised, because sure, the example you gave, they were right to go someplace else, because in the limited domain of human life, which we all are mostly trapped within, even though we're trying to think outside it, things were bad and they went somewhere else. Now, but part of the conversation we're having here is actually trying to think outside that limited domain or definition of what human life is. I would somehow hope that even though we're so diverse in this room, we could somehow come up with an agreement of what's worth not damaging. If not what's worth saving, at least what's worth not damaging. It goes back to the basic thing, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of course, there are some people who want to be eaten alive in strange rituals, and we should perhaps let them do that, but not eat us alive in strange rituals, because we don't want to be consumed in strange rituals. I hope you see the kind of slightly silly but serious point I'm making here. But we're trying to think outside the boundaries of those specific definitions of individual and collective liberty. And right now, the idea that because one would get from Spain to another country, maybe, let's say, Walter Benjamin, who was trying to make an exit before World War II broke out and didn't quite make it, if one was trying to make that exit, the narrative that we understand and that we usually apply, and it's also cinematic logic, right? What we apply is the person either made it or they didn't make it. And when we project that experience back onto ourselves, Frederick Jameson says it's very hard for humans to see films and make films these days and think the collective. And he wrote this, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. I think it was in Geopolitical Geopolitical Aesthetic. I think he's right. It's very hard for us to look at a massive collective and stop thinking about ourselves as the diagram of the human. I wanted to just mention Benjamin Bratton tonight because not only is he a good friend, but he's a really important thinker in this space. And one thing that Ben has said repeatedly is we need to evacuate the diagram of the human. And when Ben says that, I've always read him saying that in two ways. One is we need to empty most of what we think the diagram of the human is because it comes with a lot of useless baggage that has just done damage for millennia. But I think another reading of it, which maybe he actually doesn't intend, but it's my reading, is we need to evacuate it. There's a human diagram, and we need to get it out of where it is. We need to evacuate it. It's in a sinking ship, and we need to evacuate the sinking ship. And the thing about Ben's use of that term is he doesn't think about humans in a simplistic way. He's trying to radically reimagine what the diagram of the human is, to then have a conversation, and again, maybe we could invoke Reza Negarestani's recent piece on the labor of the human and the inhuman. He's trying to think really, really deeply about what's worth preserving in the human and what the nature of human is, to then talk about it. And again, the point that I would just reiterate here is like, we usually think of self. And that would be one of the biggest arguments I have with much of what I understand around the exit and secessionist movement. It premises everything on a sense of self. Each of us is a universe, a colony of intersecting epigenetic landscapes. The bacteria in your stomach is changing your gene expression. It changes the way you think. All of us. Literally, during your lifetime, you become an epigenetic landscape that intersects with hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of other landscapes. So the evolution in those companion species affects your evolution and my evolution. So when we look at the human and we say, oh, but Walter Benjamin made it out of Europe, or he didn't make it out of Europe, you know, we understand the pathos of his failure to make it out of Europe. But the truth is, we shouldn't only be looking at whether Walter Benjamin made it out of Europe or not. Just like when John Ford makes a film, a Western like The Searchers, you know, we shouldn't really be understanding if it was Ethan who was played by, help me out here, huge American actor, John Wayne, whether he really can reintegrate with his family after almost killing the woman because she became naturalized with Indians or not. Right, like that, for me, that's the really deep failing of the American myth that we were just talking about a moment ago. The deep failing that we individualize instead of collectivize our ability to think the human. And that's played out over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's like this litany of narrative that we can't escape, which is why Jameson is against it. I think Jameson's against it. If we could only think the radically non-human and then do, I'm not sure what your company's doing, but then reimagine the human, practically speaking, instead of trying to make ourselves superhumans, you know, or the alpha human, then maybe there might be something worth saving there. You know, I could be completely wrong, but that's, as you can tell, I have a very strong opinion about that because I keep seeing the model of the human being reduced to almost nothing that I would want to save. It's the model that does violence to other humans and to other species. And I would love it if the model was this radically imbricated, capillary, connected model, which also could talk about the human. You know, and that's why I mentioned the city earlier on in one of the comments I made, because when you really dissolve into the city, you become part of a collective, you become the human in the crowd, and you're not just individual. You're individual, but you're multiple. You know, when we started this conversation, there were two of us, but we were already multiple, so there was already quite a crowd, to steal a line from some folks. You know, so I feel like that's a model that's really important, at least to argue about, right? Like, ultimately, we might say, but yeah, but we can save ourselves. Like, you'll be alive in 1,000 years if we just do these tweaks to you. Don't you want to do that? And probably everyone in the room would be like, maybe. But can I bring my gut bacteria with me? Because they're changing the way that I think. I should have written it.
We can also replace all of them with better gut bacteria, and we can probably change the mutation rates so that they'll stay the same rather than evolving over.
I'm totally with you on that front, but probably half of what I just said should have been written in red ink, right?
Okay, one last question. Just kind of tying together a couple things that have been mentioned. First, the
you know, the individual versus the collective. Second, kind of differences in the connotations of coverage of different secessionist movements, like the coverage of, you know, neuroatypicals wanting to, you know, be with people who take less effort to interact with and who they can interact with more easily, more readily, and so on, versus the coverage of, say, the American readout, I don't know how it's pronounced either, or the League of the South, or so on. And then going back to Thieves versus Files, and Nick Land and I went back and forth on this, and I'm not sure if we ever came to a conclusion, but it's something along the lines of a Theed is a social group, and then a file is a social group that is passed down, that can be inherited. And not just necessarily in the biological sense, like, say, Christianity and Islam probably have, I would guess, I don't know off the top of my head, but probably have higher, you know, if the parents are Christian, then the children are more likely to be Christian, and if the parents have Asperger's, the child is more likely to have Asperger's. So, you know, I hope I'm using the term right, the hot secessionism, where, you know, it's about the group identity versus simple instrumentality. You know, if we move to a seastead, we don't have to pay taxes, versus something like the neuroatypicals or the League of the South or ISIS or so on. And then escaping in place, because it seems like it should be easier for Thieves to do that. You know, you have rationalist group houses and so on. So, and Burning Man, of course, temporary Thievish escape in place. I don't think you can have temporary phyletic. Well, there are
also
right,
queer communes scattered across the country. So like
yeah. So like, what are there any? Assuming that this is an important distinction to make, even, what are the practical differences between Thievish and phyletic secessionism?
Phyletic seems almost like preservational, like it needs to establish lineage. So I guess with the tech-secessionists, I could very easily see that becoming almost eugenic very quickly. Whereas Thieves there is no lineage, is that correct? So I guess they're more open to change. But what is it that you're asking specifically?
So, like the differences in likelihood and in how this would be realized. Yeah, that's a better question. What possibilities are open for Thievish secessionism that aren't open for phyletic secessionism? What possibilities are open for phyletic secessionism that aren't open for Thievish secessionism? And also, I kind of wanted to just clarify the terms that were mentioned and then glossed over. So, or mentioned and then moved past. So.
Is there like a non-Nick Land version of that vocabulary that we can use? What is that?
Not from Nick Land.
Sorry?
It's from the Diamond Age, not from Nick Land.
Excuse me. Okay, is there a D. Stevenson version of that of the terms that we could use?
Right. So,
like inherited versus chosen, or like what's it?
Inherited versus chosen, sure, but passed down versus, you know, Thieves would be like subcultures or Burning Man. And there was something else.
Well, I think I think I actually read this exchange about the file and feed, kind of like modes of secession, like with Nick Land. I think like somehow, if I remember correctly, like how he actually defined it is actually like the file, like the very definition of like a file. Yeah, pronounce it right. File. It is its capacity to secede. Like a feed, like you know, like a group of like black metal fans. You know, that like as a community that's not perhaps, you know, like a sustainable like collective like whereas something, you know, like around like ethnicity or for example like a religion would would be this, and of course then there's this like speculation of this like this kind of like cold phase that might have then. Yeah, this kind of like instrument, like purely like instrumental, like motives for collective. So I guess I mean like so I mean just like using the term like I guess like the answer would be like a Thief can't secede, right?
Temporarily.
Yeah,
they could.
And a file cannot, because they're genetically connected to something?
Yeah, that was like the beginning of an exchange. Nick Land wanted to repurpose the word feed, and it was later redefined, so creating a typology between feeds and files. But it, you know, by the lack of response, maybe it's just not a useful categorization, and that's a useful answer too.
I guess I would wonder what actually is the root cause of a file or fee to exist. Instead of saying that it's a decision process or a cultural choice, I would try to pull back and take a meta position and say, what causes cultural choices or inheritable cultures in general? What's like the epiphenomenal root cause of that being possible at all? And try to de-anthropomorphize it as much as possible. And I guess I have a tendency to look outside a specific disciplinary framework for conceptual models from other disciplinary frameworks, like the sciences, where I can see the basic behavior of a system. Like when you identify turbulence in a fluid system, you can actually then take the abstraction of turbulent onset, like a moment of turbulence onset, and you can then apply it across a range of different domains that don't look like fluid flowing. But you can model them using the exact same model that you would model to model liquid flowing through a pipe. And so in that sense, I would try to take an abstract model and use it as an analytic tool across the phenomenon of the file in general to see what best models it in terms of what we know about humans and what causes inheritance. I mean, to be honest, it would be very interesting to look at inheritance of religions across every spectrum of human encounter, including the notorious companion species of bacteria and viruses I've mentioned, because I'm quite sure that you would start tracing a range of parallel trajectories of transmission across the past 1,000 years. And whether that's correlation or it's actually causation, I don't know. But it would be very interesting to start to map that out. For example, Sadie Plant was mentioned briefly because she was at CCRU with Nick Land back in the 90s. And she wrote fairly recently a very beautiful short text for the Spam book, bless you, which talked about the fact that tulips, when they have viruses, or at least several hundred years ago, would exhibit this extraordinary mutations in the flower, which then led to an enormous human economic bubble around the value of tulips for decades, which ultimately crashed. But at one point, tulips were being traded multiple times the way that we trade things today. Tulips were worth more than houses in the 1600s, if I remember correctly. Individual tulips. Why? Because they exhibited this mutation. No one knew why the mutation existed. Turns out it was an infection. So there was a tulip, which is a companion species to a human, if you will, to borrow a term. But the tulip had a companion species, which was the viral infection, which then, in some crazy and completely arbitrary aesthetic domain, which we humans have, became valuable, which then led to this incredible breeding and exchange of tulips, which ultimately became a bubble, which ultimately collapsed. So I feel like her example there it's just a beautiful example where she starts to identify a range of systems which cause other systems to behave that we usually don't track, we usually don't register them. But she's clearly pointing out, it isn't like the virus decided to cause an economic bubble in Dutch tulip exchange, but it just so happened that it did. And it isn't that humans were aware of it, but you see there was a relationship. And so I would look for those kinds of much broader systemic relationships to try to understand what would make it possible for a kind of inheritance to succeed or not. That would be my first attempt to crack that.
Thanks. Maybe that's it. Because we're running out of time and there's still drinks to be had. Well, thanks to you.
But